century skill, but I was afraid nobody would believe me. So when we get to the end, I hope I will have convinced you of something along those lines. I want to start with the word relevance, because that is a huge word in my own discipline of history. How do we make history relevant? How do we get our students to understand it in their own lives? How do we bring it to them? There's a lot of over-communication in this world and distraction, and we all live very busy lives. So how do we make history relevant to them? You know, we all, I think, want to be these somewhat global citizens with some awareness of other cultures and fluency in those cultures possibly, and, you know, awareness and contact with things that are other. And at least in my discipline, I don't think there's anything more other and more different and really as unique as the study of the past. If you want weird, you can find it in the past. And so I think with that issue of relevance, we've been asking the wrong question. And I actually want to ask, should we be making history relevant, or should we be having our students encounter it as much as they can on their own terms? And that's what I'm going to argue today. And that's when I see the real value of art history, because it's this immediate access to the past. It's this, you know, most of history is closed to us, right? It's gone, we have texts, we have documents. We sometimes have to have a facility in another language to read those, but with art history, it's this visible, tangible, emotional, intellectual, sometimes visceral response to something that's real, a real product of the past, something you can reach out and touch. You shouldn't, but you could. You know, I don't encourage you to do that. And I want to acknowledge the fact that art history has a history of detractors. It's elitist. It's opaque, it's hard to understand, it's obscure, and, you know, worst of all, I think the great sin in the 21st century is it's not useful, right? We all want to do things that are useful, and this doesn't strike us as useful. Some of you may remember President Obama's speech in 2014 when he made a joke about people who got degrees in trade and skill sets would make more money than art historians. And he even kind of joked in the speech, like, don't send me emails about this. And of course he was flooded with emails from art historians and graduate students and curators. And he very graciously apologized for the comment. But the point is that bias is really deeply embedded in our culture. So I want to come at this from the point of cognitive psychology, if you'll bear with me for a moment. And I don't know if you have a favorite cognitive psychologist. I do. And his name is Daniel Willingham. I'm a huge fan. And in a blog post that he wrote a few years ago, about 21st century skills, he said, and I thought this was kind of an interesting thing that has stuck with me, that students are really not incapable of paying attention. And I would generalize and say that we are much like that as well. They're just very quick to deem things not worth the effort. And I thought that has stayed with me. I think he wrote that 3 or 4 years ago, and I thought, okay, so how do we get them to make that effort? How do we convince them that this is a worthwhile effort? And in that blog post, he references a Harvard art history and architecture professor called Jennifer Roberts, who makes her students go to the Boston Museum of Art and spend 3 hours looking at a piece of their choosing. So just think about that for a minute, what 3 hours feels like looking at a piece of art. I'm not sure, I mean, I'm obsessed with art history, and I don't think I've ever done it, probably not even with pieces I have in my own house, you know. So 3 hours is deliberately meant to feel onerous. And in her talk about the power of patience, which you can see and read online, she does it herself, and it's a fascinating catalog of what she notices when she gives herself the time. And so her idea at the end is that when we give students access to something, when we make it relevant to them, it's not really the same as actual learning. What turns that access into learning is time and this idea of what she calls strategic patience. Or as I tell my students, just because we can Google a lot of things doesn't mean we've actually learned anything. So that access doesn't translate into learning unless we make it that way. So, you know, not wanting to send my students necessarily to a museum to look at something for 3 hours, and I was starting the Renaissance in my history class, so I had kind of the perfect storm for exposing them to a painting. And I thought, let's see what happens. I want to see what comes out of this. And we looked at Giotto's Lamentation, a very early Renaissance painting. I gave them no background, I gave them no reading, no lecture material, and I divided them into groups, and I said, okay, group 1, I want you to collaborate, just tell me what you see, tell me what you notice. Group 2, you have to look at this painting for 10 minutes. And surprisingly, they were like, okay, it didn't feel that bad. And so my collaboration group, when we kind of came back together, I said, well, what did you see? And they said, well, it's a post-crucifixion scene, which interestingly enough, they didn't get that from the title, but they got it from the nail holes that they observed in Christ's feet. And then they said, well, it's very colorful. There are 2 figures with their backs to us, and the angels were not like angels they had seen before. So all true things, but essentially shallow, right? And so then I turned to my students who had actually stared at this painting for 10 minutes. And I said, what did y'all notice? And here are some of their observations. Here's where it gets interesting. One student said, well, when I look at those angels, I see birds in flight, especially those 4 in the center. And it makes me think that the artist had contact with nature and was a keen observer of it. Now bear in mind that I didn't ask my students to interpret anything. I just asked them to look and tell me what they saw. And then they said, the head of Jesus is lower than anyone else in the painting. I noticed this, and the reason I noticed this, and I thought about it, I thought, why would a painter do that? Well, it must be that maybe he's trying to make the point that Jesus has just sacrificed himself for humanity, and he's making the visual point that Jesus has lowered himself to the deepest part of that painting. And then they said that ledge in the middle, which leads you down visually to the figure of Christ, so they said, this is a barrier between the earthly and heavenly worlds. And Jesus' body is off the ground. We can't really tell how. It's a little sort of strange in the painting. And it said it makes it seem as if he's not of either world. Like he's somewhere at this moment when this scene takes place, in between both worlds. And then they said, you think I'm going to stop soon, but there's more. Like this just kept going and going and going. And they said this apostle in the center, and interestingly enough, my collaboration group didn't identify any figures in the painting as apostles or Mary or anything like that, but the students who looked at it for a long time just initially used that vocabulary, just kind of instantly. And they said that apostle in the center has his arms spread out, like he's mimicking the crucifixion because he's almost reminding us of this grotesqueness that has just happened off screen, so to speak. And then another student said, you can see that circle in the bottom corner, said there's only 2 people whose feet are showing. And the student said, I think that it's Peter. And he said, I think it's Peter because he and Jesus have that little altercation at the Last Supper about him not wanting Jesus to wash his feet. And so he said, I think Peter's feet become important. And I went, wow, like, I looked at my collaboration group and I was like, well. And so 2 things really came out of this for me. One was that the collaboration is just too easy. They wanted to get to the point. They wanted to get to what I saw. And there was an article in Psychology Today a few years ago that got a lot of replay in various media outlets, that collaboration can sometimes breed false confidence. They sort of got to the answer right away, and then they were convinced that there was nothing left to see after 3 minutes. It can introduce pressures to conform because they're all kind of feeding off of each other. And it can also sort of promote laziness because the collaboration group was the only group to complain about the 10-minute time. They went, 10 minutes is really long. And my other people who were just looking at the painting never complained. But the real thing that I think comes out of this, and I'll put the painting back up so you can see it, is, and what kind of got to me was with this strategic patience that Dr. Roberts talks about, they were able to literally, with no background from me, literally read a 14th century language from someone who's been dead for almost 700 years, someone who has nothing in common with them, who was born in a farmhouse, who has none of their training, doesn't speak any of our students' native languages, And yet, through that communication tool and through some time, they were able to understand exactly what he's saying, because art is that communication tool. And that just kind of, really sort of blew my mind. I was like, that's incredible that they can do that. And then when we did lecture on the Renaissance and do activities and look at other paintings, we had this much richer experience from it. So, what I kind of took away from this was, could they do it again? Then I looked at that painting and I thought, maybe it's the Christianity piece that's too similar. Maybe I have enough students who would be familiar with Christian iconography. What if I give them a Chinese scroll from the same time period, maybe 14th century? Could they do it again? So we repeated the experiment. And then I thought, could they do it with a piece of early Byzantine architecture? And also my favorite place, so I didn't want them to mess this up. And then I thought, what about a Sumerian tablet, calendar, or an astronomical tablet? And then I thought, what about a piece of African-American post-impressionism? What would they do with that? And then I thought, I kept going, and I thought, what about something that they might have seen before, pop culture, something that may be a little more familiar to them? What about something drastically different, like a post-surrealist piece of jewelry, which is Dali, but I didn't tell them that. And in every single case, my collaboration group reached a consensus very quickly, and my group that was staring at this piece of art for 10 minutes at a time had deeper, more thoughtful, more interesting ideas, and they had more questions at the end of it. And it was really sort of fascinating. So to circle back to the relevance for just a minute, and to go back to Dan Willingham, who talks about this cognitive psychology and this idea of strategic patience, he makes his point that if we don't do this, if we don't let our students see these things on their own terms, then we are depriving them and ourselves, in doing it for ourselves, of that joy of uncovering many layers to something that we actually thought we already knew. And as teachers, we shouldn't be doing that. And so I'll end with one of Dan Willingham's quotes where he says, this strategic patience, this idea of taking time, it may not be the 21st century skill of the greatest importance, but it may well be the one that's in shortest supply. Thank you.